Now we turn to Asia, and we're going to start off with China as we normally do. And we will talk about Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, because it's obviously a big factor in terms of kind of what's happening, where's the relationship between the U.S. and China, what is happening with the Taiwan Strait, and what does that mean going forward. So, but first we want to look at what type of platform is China working with, and when you look at the economic backdrop, there's a lot of concern in terms of where the economy is heading, which is why they have finally gotten rid of a lot of their target, and you're seeing a lot of pressure in terms of the SPB or special purpose bonds. So I was having a great conversation with Matt Warder, and we were discussing what is happening right now with credit impulses. And one of the things that I've been able to deduce, and we talked about it last week, the loan demand for private companies, small, medium, and large, micro, doesn't matter, is down. It's negative. If you total it all together, it's negative 13 or 14%. But yet credit impulses are positive. So for me, it's like, okay, well, if you look at SOEs, SOE profits are up, but privates are down. So there is a clear indication at this point, because credit growth or credit impulses are still positive, that the government is essentially saying, look, you're going to take one of these bonds and you're going to retire one of your old ones. So you're going to take one in, retire one, and that you're going to see that growth. And that's how they're trying to show some of this support. And they keep dictating SPBs and special purpose bonds. But as we said last year, a lot of this money, even though it's being indicated of we're going to stimulate, we're going to use it, it's not being moved into the market. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So financial direct investment year to date, 17.4%. It's actually moving in the wrong direction, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. Composite PMI last month was 54.1, came in at 52.5. Manufacturing is in contraction, was expected at 50.3, came in at 49. So again, moving in the wrong direction. Non-manufacturing was expected at 53.9, came in at 53.8. So some of the service side improved. Again, you have people who are in lockdowns for so long, you're going to have some of that activity come back. That's where we think there's the most downside, because manufacturing is already going to slow. We've talked about it in segment 1. We're going to talk about it again later in this segment, because the leading indicators are showing you trade is slowing, and China is a massive exporter with a lot of manufacturing, which is why we see that pressure. Caxton put in something similar, expected to be at 51.5, came in at 50.4. So again, slight positive, but still on the wrong side. So if you take 49, 50.4, you're like, it's either flat or slightly contracting. Then when you look at the composite, it was at 54, slowing down from the prior, but services continued to be the driver, coming at 55.5, well above the estimate of 53.9. And that's where, again, we see that slowdown, especially when we start looking at the leading indicators, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, because when you look at it, the employment is down, the consumer confidence is at a record low. So again, that's where we see some of these pressure points. But when we look at least 10 provinces have published their audits for 2021 budgets. Last year, local governments did a pretty terrible job of deploying special purpose bonds. And why? And if you've been watching us, our whole thesis around why is because there's no projects, and if there are projects, they don't meet any type of return, and the ones they've already issued are so far underwater, they're getting buried by not only interest but also principal, because the local governments and provincial governments have to backstop these terrible bonds that were written over the last couple of years. So per the audit, you're going to be shocked to know that it was lack of suitable projects and diversion of funds to pay government salaries. Now you might think of, well, why are you diverting funds to pay yourselves? And for those that have been watching us, we've been saying Governments don't have enough money to finance their massive payroll. It's a communist organization. Communism equals a lot of government employees. But the problem is they have issued, and the CCP has done a significant amount of their own fiscal stimulus by cutting taxes, VATs, and then so when you look at cutting taxes, a slowdown in the economy, which is obviously going a huge issue. So their income has gotten diminished, not to mention that real estate is a huge income driver for them. So a lot of this money was like, look, we'll borrow it from ourselves and use it there. And that's another big problem. So when you look at it in Henan province, 15.6 billion renminbi sat idle for over 6 months. And then when you look at 3.4 billion was misappropriated to pay salaries and other expenses. Shandong province counted 36 projects that hadn't met planning and environmental assessment standards when bonds were issued, delaying their deployment. All of that has big implications for 2022. Nearly 2 trillion renminbi in SPBs have been issued since the start of May, alongside 1.1 trillion in additional stimulus funding through the policy banks. The numbers in these audits are a bad sign for the prospects of the second half of 2022 stimulus. I can't stress enough how they keep going back to the same well that ran dry 2 years ago. And now you're just not going to get this going forward. And a large chunk of that stimulus will end up in wasteful projects and government worker paychecks, but even more is going to end up absolutely nowhere. Infrastructure spending won't be the white knight. Now we are going to introduce the talk about Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, but then we're going to talk about it again next time, because now we want to talk about the countermeasures in terms of what's going to happen going forward. So again, we never thought a plane was getting shot down. That's absurd, but it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be very aggressive countermeasures. So when you look at what is going to happen, the military exercises are going to begin, and they're the largest in decades. So they're scheduled to last 72 hours, and they're going to kick off 6 maritime areas around Taiwan. You will be shocked to know that they're going to practice surrounding Taiwan. I know it's shocking that they're going to do that. The People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command said the drills will include conventional missile tests in waters off Taiwan's east coast. China has warned commercial airlines and ships to avoid passing through the area. And then at the same time, 27 Chinese aircraft entered Taiwan's air defense zone, with 22 of them crossing the median line of the Taiwan Strait, prompting, again, the scramble of jets. The number crossing the median line was the largest since Taiwan started making public the size of Chinese insurgents in 2020. Despite their scope and intensity, right now, the PLA is trying to tackle their weakness, which is joint command, trying to show that they're going to do something. And if you consider, they made a huge deal about this internally. So they have to do something. They have to show some sort of action. But when you look at the economic backdrop and how important the U.S. and the West is to their just even muddling along, it's going to be difficult to get a much bigger response. So when you look at this, the point is it's just political theater. And it's why we don't see too much in terms of it. The bigger question is, is the U.S. going to respond? Because a lot of trade goes through the Taiwan Strait. This is a huge component, literally, to a lot of tech, a lot of chips. We can't let this get in the way. So again, the problem is the more military stuff you have in one area, the more likely there is for an error. And if that error happens, if tensions are already so high and people just need an excuse, that's when you start to see things spiral out of control quickly. We have seen it happen over the last 150,000 years, and it'll happen for the next 150,000 years. This is where those problems could arise. But it's important to appreciate that they have now gotten rid of or abandoned the target. So the question is now, did they abandon the targets for GDP growth permanently, or is this just because the target of 5.5% is a laughable number? And here's where you start to see the move where median forecasts for economists for GDP growth in China is at 4%, still grossly exaggerated, with the IMF coming closer to what is likely of something around 3%, and we would say that it's a bit lower at something just north of 1%. But again, you're getting this walk back. So when you look at where it is, so Bloomberg was the one that broke the story. So the 5.5 target would serve as guidance, but there won't be penalties for failing to achieve it. Top leaders admitted hitting the target was no longer possible. Way back in December, again, we've talked about the headwinds to do it. It's unlikely. And now with the stimulus getting you nowhere, it's going to be that much worse. Top leaders are more optimistic. And again, it's just going to be a matter of where is this going to go in the future? So Beijing and local governments won't abandon current stimulus efforts, especially with the Congress coming up. So they're still going to try to stimulate. It's just they're not going to try to get as aggressive and stimulate foolishly to 5.5%. What it does mean is that Beijing won't dial up those stimulus efforts again to create these underlying problems. And it's going to be important to see how does it look going forward in terms of, do we continue to see this stimulus come through? Do we continue to see GDP targets given, or do they just give you a guidance? And again, I think that's going to be a question that we're going to see for next year. So now back to this to Pelosi. So what happened and what were some of the things done and some of the comments that were made in terms of what came from Washington, what came from Pelosi. So the U.S. made a commitment 43 years ago that we would defend Taiwan, and nobody has been there. I believe it's since 1997, and that's again just showing the determination, especially in light of what is happening with Russia, Ukraine, in light of a lot of the uprisings that have been happening. You need to confirm and reaffirm some of these views on how we would stand in the South China Sea. And I think it's important to also, because we have a lot of technological innovation that's being created and a lot of it's being manufactured in Taiwan. And now we want to bring some of that home, but we don't want to make it seem like we're going to bring stuff back into the States and leave Taiwan high and dry. So there's a certain amount of how this is going. And for those that have been watching us from the beginning, and I'll repost the show, one of the first shows we ever did was that the Chinese, and the way we broke it down was that the relations between China and the U.S. have been in a downward trajectory. And now there's ebbs and flows along the way, but again, the trend has been set, and it's been set since the Tiananmen Square. And that's why, again, this is just another move down in relations when you're looking at how the U.S. and China are going to interact. So when you look at the party and their comments, the visit proves once again that some American politicians have become the troublemakers in China relations, and the United States has become the biggest destroyer of peace in the Taiwan Strait. Attempts to undermine China's peaceful rise will inevitably lead to broken heads and bloodshed. Again, broken heads and bloodshed is more of a saying. It's not that it's going to happen. It's just that, broken chains and things in terms of how the relationship goes. Congress, as a part of the U.S. government, is inherently obliged to strictly observe the one China policy. China is opposed to the visit, not surprising. Various government departments have announced some retaliatory measures. Announced the People's Liberation Army would conduct the drills. The General Administration of Customs suspended imports of Taiwanese citrus and fish. And the Minister of Commerce has suspended exports of sand to Taiwan. Remember, sand is important to making microchips. But again, China also needs Taiwan's microchips, so it goes both ways. The mildness of the countermeasures have left some Chinese citizens feeling let down, especially after the wall-to-wall media coverage. So the whole point of Beijing's fire and brimstone rhetoric was to look tough but when you look at what has failed in terms of a sensitive backdrop, China wants to avoid looking like a paper tiger, which is why we're going to continue to see some of these future things where China's commercial and military response will likely be ongoing and will intense over the coming weeks, and it will likely expand. While they will avoid a military standoff, the party will now feel even more pressure to act decisively next time around. But if they don't, they could lose popular support, which means how will the next response be? And is this that ratcheting up? What is that going to look like? And when, if an accident happens, how is that responded to? And that's the problem when you get towards brinkmanship. Where does that fall? Where does that line fall? Because it's a very fuzzy, gray, moving target, which can be an underlying problem. And when you look at it in general, most serious mainland strategists believe that an invasion would be a disaster for China in terms of its human, military, and economic and diplomatic cost. So they want to act tough, but Beijing also knows that they can't, or at least believes from their strategists that they don't have the footprint to do it, because it would take essentially a landing force equivalent to D-Day to land on Taiwan. And just think about the human cost of landing on D-Day in World War II, but think about how there's also been a huge increase in innovation in just the deadliness of equipment. And if you consider what the Germans were firing at our soldiers landing on D-Day, you're talking about artillery and machine gun fire. Now we're looking at targeted harpoon missiles and things on levels that, so the human life toll would be massive on both sides. And that, again, these are things to consider, because nothing happens in a vacuum. So then when you start looking at some of the more serious pieces, the U.S. policymakers have sworn up and down to their Chinese counterparts that the policy hasn't changed, again, trying to solidify or at least protect kind of where some of those views are. And the thing is, and so Trivium said this, and I do agree that this is a move up in brinkmanship. And again, I don't see it being pared back, at least in the foreseeable future. So China as deflationary force. So China PPI versus commodity prices. When you start looking at PPI in China, the inflation de-anchoring narrative, is weakening in terms of the inflation curve in U.S. and Eurozone strongly inverted with long-term values approaching central bank targets. China is exporting deflationary pressure, but China PPI points to sharply falling commodity prices. But when you look at when do they fall, and when you break down where China is right now, even though PPI has come down, it's still elevated against estimates. You're still getting a lot of subsidies from the Chinese government to kind of insulate CPI. So I think that the China PPI view in terms of that year-over-year change, yes, it's good, but it's also elevated versus where it should be. And when you look at the raw materials still are in short supply. And that short supply piece is, I think, very important when you're looking at where a price is going to go, and that's going to keep some of the commodity prices elevated, even though they should be paring back a bit. Then when you look at, again, China general business activity moving up, but employment is still down. And not only down, but getting worse. And I think that's the underlying problem when you look at where spending is, where growth is. So Premier Lee said that the price of food underpins 100 other prices. Food prices make up about 20% of China's consumer price index. And then Lee reminded those gathered that China has thus far managed to keep inflation under control, but it's up through a lot of these subsidies, which again, they're not going to be willing to unwind, especially given the issues now with Taiwan and the U.S. and these pressure points. Stimulus isn't going to work, so they're going to have to rely on other things to protect themselves, and this is going to be one of them. Consumer confidence bounced, but you get an idea, just still at massively terrible position. Net capital flows continues to be grossly negative in China. We don't see that changing, especially given some of the pivots now with the pressure and the issues that have continued to grow between China and the U.S. Housing construction deteriorates faster in the first half of 2022. And as we've said before, we don't see that changing, even with some of the soft support that they're trying to throw out there. It's just not going to be the case. The State Council called for infrastructure investment to accelerate. Again, we've already kind of debunked how these SPBs just aren't going to go where they're going to go. However, they are going to continue to try. Projects must be mature, effective, and able to play a role as soon as possible. Investments should focus on effectiveness and timely decision-making. Again, we already know that it didn't happen in 2021. And we said in 2021 it wasn't going to happen because all of the good projects are gone and everything left doesn't meet these requirements, even the looser requirements, creating these bigger issues. And then looking at China manufacturing PMI, but new export orders are the biggest issue. New export orders are going further negative again, leading back to the problem we're talking about on economic growth. Backlog of orders significantly worse. Again, it's just a massive drop. And these more leading indicators, while input prices have now moved into the deflationary standpoint, which is, if you think about how is that happening, there is a good chance that subsidies are rolling through in order to bring prices down to keep themselves competitive on the export market and trying to bridge some of that backlog in orders. Output prices also coming down, same thing. When you look at China manufacturing PMI, again, as we spoke about, and then non-manufacturing PMI coming back down, but still, again, staying a bit elevated. But now when you look at the mortgage revolt, and again, coming all the way back through what we discussed, how we're discussing it, there is a lot of pressure because people are boycotting. There are a lot of people in pain, so they have to protect prices. They have to show toughness against Taiwan because there is a lot of disenfranchised people who are unemployed, poor, getting poorer, can't consume, even though that's what China's been trying to do. And this is where there is a lot of things unhinging at the same time within China. Two major banks' mortgage exposure exceeded a regulatory red line. Again, they were told to do it, even though they can say till they're blue in the face. But again, just gives you an idea of how there is going to be, I guarantee you, even more off balance sheet, which is going to be a huge problem. Monthly new home sales in China, again, continuing to move down to be, again, stabilizing, but not moving in a meaningful direction higher. Developer sales, it just gives you an idea of July 2022, excuse me, versus July 2021. And we don't see it changing anytime soon. And the slump is going to persist, and it continues to deepen this year, dragging the economy and banks with it. And China's bank loans to the property sector ballooned over the years. So you've had a cascading issue. And if you think about mortgage loans at 40 trillion yuan, developer loans at 15 trillion yuan, again, 300 renminbi of a bad loan situation is going to do nothing to, again, bridge some of this gap. When we turn to China, to India, the infrastructure industries, last month it was 19.3, this month was 12.7. So again, things are getting a bit worse, but still growth. India PMI manufacturing came in at 56.4. Composite came in at 56.6. Services came in at 55.5. So this is what we were talking about, and you have to compare it to the prior because they don't do estimates. Our whole view is that services are coming way down because local demand is diminishing aggressively. Manufacturing, on the other hand, we've been saying that exports were going to stay stronger, longer here because of the pivot out of China. But based on the leading indicators from Taiwan and South Korea and now China, we see this also diminishing, which is why we remain concerned on Indian growth. And the bigger issue in terms of where this is going to arise is the deficit. So if you look at the deficit, it went from 12.9 to 14.8. And we don't see that improving, only getting worse, even as rates continue to rise, increasing the stress. South Korea, in terms of industrial production, came in at 1.9%, better than expected. But exports, remember, imports were expected at 22.7, came in at 21.8. Exports came in at 9.4, slightly below estimates. And we see that continuing to move down as manufacturing has now gone negative. Expected to be, last month was 51.3, came in at 49.8. So again, you're starting, the cracks are there, while CPI continues to trend up. India manufacturing, you had that nice little spike in terms of the move up with ASEAN manufacturing flatlining. But again, we see, some, as we talked about in segment 1, some of that starting to roll over and resulting in some of that pressure. While South Korea's CPI, as you can see here, core, and all in, you continue to see the upward momentum. Household employment and income expectations are at decade lows in China. Income expectations. So when you start looking at how this all comes together, which is, and the reason why it comes after talking about the ASEAN is because they're trying to become a part of that as however they can. And when you look at the income expectations, this is going to hit, again, hard in terms of local consumption, leading to more problems under the Chinese umbrella. While China FDI, foreign direct investment, continues is now below where it was in 2021. So again, even though it's positive, you're seeing some of this pressure as you have more outflows. Now, Japan on the other side, Japan consumer confidence expected 31.5, came in at 30.2. Semiconductor prices have broken their long-standing downtrend as you're starting to see some of this, again, come back up in terms of where their standpoints are. Now, they're starting to see them move lower, but we still see you still see some of this in terms of the pressure on pricing being a net positive for Korean imports because the prices are down, which will help deflate some prices in the U.S., but Taiwan prices are still elevated again, so trying to kind of offsetting, leading to, again, a bit more of that stagflation side, but still moving in the right direction to bring prices a bit lower. And this just looks at India, 8 core industries and where they sit. And then when you look at Japan retail trade, again, expected at 0.2, came in at negative 1.4%, steeply negative. Taiwan and Korean equities are pricing in a deep recession, which we think is becoming more and more likely, especially when you look at some of the geopolitical stress that is coming up, with manufacturing PMI in Korea now negative, with exports, coming in a bit better, imports bouncing. But again, this is a dollar value and we're looking at volumes. So even though dollar values have gone up, volumes have come down, again, on the back of inflation. So one of the things that we just wanted to finish off with and just try to bring it all together is the issues in China. That, typically when things are booming, you don't have wars, you don't have you can have aggressive geopolitical policies, but it's when things start to unhinge and things start to break down that you see more risk. And I think when you look at how hard hit the consumer is on an employment side, on a sentiment side, on a spending front, that's when there's more risk grows of how long that saber rattling will look and what that brinkmanship will become. And I think that's going to be a key piece when we look at what is happening in the Asian theater. And I think it's important to appreciate that as we go forward. So that's what we have for you today. If you have any questions, again, you can find us in the comments section on Twitter. We appreciate your feedback and your continued support. Thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.